Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming again to the next in our series of Knox Trail programs. Very delighted that there's this continuing interest in Knox, and I don't think you won't find it, hopefully not too much repetition. We're trying to, each talk has really focused on a different aspect of Knox and the Knox Road. So just for next week, we will be having another talk, the same Thursday, next Thursday at 7 p.m. Ron Bernard will be giving a talk about the local taverns in Otis and Sandusfield, particularly in Sandusfield, that supported the Knox Teamsters. So keep an eye out for that, and hope you will join us for that. The following week, 2 weeks from now, Tom Ragusa will be here to present his talk. That had been scheduled for a couple of weeks ago, but he was ill, so we rescheduled that for 2 weeks from tonight. And his talk is about the tracing the route of the road, Ye Trodden Path, finding the Knox Trail in Sandusfield and Otis, and it's about 8 miles of the original trail that is in not original condition, but is better preserved than almost anywhere else. Goes through a lot of state forest, and it's an amazing thing. And he's spent probably 20 years researching and walking and marking and measuring and documenting that. So that'll be a fascinating talk as well. And finally, in a month or so, we don't have an exact date, the book, the Ye Trodden Path, that is being published. Here, let me hold a copy up here. So this is a book that 5 of the local authors, each of whom has been speaking in this series, will be giving, or has written a section of this book. And hopefully in a month or so, this will be printed, and we will have a talk, kind of a book launch with the 5 authors, and copies will be available at that time. So stay tuned for that one. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Gary Levier, who is an excellent historian, has been studying South Berkshire history for as long as I can remember, and in particular has, obviously as all of us have, focused on the Knox Trail at this time. So, Gary, come on up.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Zoom folks. Does everybody have their virtual hiking boots on, I hope? I'm glad everybody's still interested in Knox. As the months have gone by, we've been worried that some people might say, enough with Knox. But, we're really into it, obviously. Somebody said to me just the other day, you 5 guys that are so interested in Knox, he was a little sarcastic. He said, you live in the past? So I'm not usually quick with responses, but it came to me and I said, no, we're not, but we occasionally vacation in the past. That seemed to shut him up. So thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how we think Knox and his Teamsters came through Columbia County into Massachusetts. I've given 4 programs over in New York State, and I was very nervous about that. I was afraid that they might consider me as an outsider coming from the Berkshires. But they were so welcoming, it was amazing. The Kinderhook group, over 100 people showed up. And Kinderhook, as well as Hillsdale, have a situation similar to here in Monterey, where we're not sure which road he took. And so I gave my thoughts and opinions, and everybody was real receptive to that. Like Greg, who's the town historian in Ghent, New York, is actually within the last couple months just found an old Indian trail, a discontinued road that he thinks might have been the actual Knox Trail rather than the roads we thought right along. So this discovery is still ongoing. And we've all talked about in another 50 years at the 300th anniversary how much more information we know.
Recording in progress.
I know one of the things that I've always said, and now we found otherwise, is that it appeared that Knox and his Teamsters were not accompanied by any military help, but recent discoveries have shown that here and there may have been some local militias that accompanied them for protection, I guess. So it's an ongoing process, and it's going to be fun to share some of what I've found with you. So I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff that past speakers have talked about, and just real quick for those that haven't heard some of the other talks. Henry Knox was a bookseller in Boston with no formal military training, but he studied, read a lot of books, and became a bit of an artillery expert. And his bookstore was often frequented by loyalists and Tories. And he married a woman, Lucy, whose parents were very strong loyalist Tories. And he quickly converted her over to the Patriot side. Lucky for us. When I was in Kinderhook, it was very interesting. They got together as a group at the House of History and said, rather than 3 cheers for Henry Knox, they said 3 cheers for his wife Lucy, which I thought was pretty cool. Because she had to put up with a lot while he was gone. He was gone quite a bit longer than he originally and everybody thought. We still marvel at how quickly he got to Boston, but it was longer than he originally thought. And for those folks that don't know, when he finally arrived with the cannons in Cambridge and then they moved him up to Dorchester Heights, it was the reason that the British left Boston earlier than they originally planned. There was a few shots fired and then some negotiations, and the British commander said, look, we're going to leave, but if you keep firing, we're going to burn the city of Boston. So they came to an agreement and let them leave, never to return, and the city was saved. So there was about 60 tons of cannons that were hauled from Fort Ticonderoga through the Berkshires and out to Boston. Folks have asked me sometimes, how much did each cannon weigh? They were all different sizes. As I get older and my hair gets grayer, I can't remember all the weights of the cannons anymore. So if we do questions at the end, I won't be able to tell you how much each cannon weighed. A couple of them were way over 1,000 pounds. And it was a struggle because they had a lot of hills to go up and down. And the Teamsters were professionals, and they figured out a system of pulleys and winches to help get the cannons and wagons and carriages up and down these hills. There's been numerous books written about Knox. Here's my favorites, particularly the one on the left written by Bernie Drew, who's in the audience tonight. Really covers everything having to do with Knox coming through Western Mass. The book in the middle is another on Henry Knox, representing several others that were done. The book on the right, I Have Chaminade, I wrote in 2011, and there's several chapters on Knox, and that reignited a lot of interest with the folks in Egremont about Knox and in Alford. In 1976, there was some marketing that went on. You can still find one of those Knox Trail glasses on eBay if you look. It was part of a set with other Revolutionary War scenes. And even though the Alford post office had been closed since I think about 1906, they brought a portable post office out to Alford and created these first day covers in Alford and then another one in North Egremont. I haven't seen one in Great Barrington. These might have been the only 2 that they did. Here's a map that kind of gives you a quick overview. If I step back like this, is this still, Mike still working up? Mike talking up? Okay. That shows how they came from Fort Ticonderoga, from Lake Champlain over to Lake George, down through New York State, across the river in Albany, then to Kinderhook, and then on through the Berkshires. Up until the 70s, it was believed that Knox and his Teamsters came down the old post road, so from Kinderhook down to Claverick and then over. And then a wonderful man who I remembered from when I was a young kid, Joe Elliott. He was the postmaster in North Egremont, as well as the storekeeper. He had nicknames for all his kids. For some reason, he called me Zeke. I don't know why. But he never talked down to us. And he was so interesting. He talked all about the Knox Trail, about how he had grown up in North Hillsdale, which back in Knox's day was called Nobletown, and how he would hear old timers tell stories about their great-grandparents that told stories about Knox coming through, and he just couldn't figure out the markers, the stone markers that were put in 1927, 28, weren't lining up with the stories that he heard, and so he started researching it. First, he hiked all the area as a youngster, and then when he was in his 60s, he started going back. He checked with the mileage from Knox's diary and measured everything and hiked a lot, and he figured out that some of the markers in New York State and Columbia County were probably placed in the wrong position. So as a result of what a small postmaster and storekeeper in Little North Egremont did, New York State changed 4 of those markers. Some folks weren't happy about that over there in New York State. That's why I was a little worried when I gave my talk. I want to share something here. But we just found in the files. There was a fellow from Germantown, New York, who was the Columbia County Historical Society director for many years, and he kept files on Knox. And Mr. Miller was his name, and he's the guy that Joe Elliott was communicating with to try to get the markers changed. And after the markers were changed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, there was a lot of grumbling. And this lady wrote, her name was Mary Seymour from West Ghent. And she kind of took care of the monument where it was in West Ghent. And she said, is there any reason to believe that Joe Elliott, the deceased dowser, which by the way, he was an amazing dowser. I watched him as a kid to find water. I was kind of a skeptic about it, but he and his son Craig Elliott, who's still around, they're both great dowsers. It works. I don't get it, but it worked. Anyway, she refers to him as a deceased dowser who is touted as an expert. They were mad, but nonetheless, the markers got changed, and I think they're pretty much close to the right position now. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'll talk about Joe Elliott a little more in a minute. So they came down Lake George. Here's a painting that was done by Wallace Noel, who I believe was from Otis.
West Otis, yeah.
West Otis. And he did a series of paintings that are on display around the screen here. And they were offered to those who went to Great Barrington Savings Bank. And I've been meaning for months to go into Berkshire Bank and see if anybody knows where the original paintings are. But I've just been too busy with all the research to go over there. Anyway, that's his imagining of the ships going through Lake George. It was a stormy time. It was winter, and they got down to south end of Lake George just as the lake was freezing over. Then they got hitched up with all the sleds and headed south towards Albany, crossed the Mohawk River and lost a cannon there, which was retrieved long after. And the question I got before is, where's that cannon now? I don't know. Then as they're crossing the newly frozen Hudson River, they almost lost one cannon, but they retrieved it. They cleverly came up with this idea. I'm not sure quite how it worked, but they had empty barrels, probably empty beer barrels, connected so that if a cannon did go in, they'd have like when you're fishing with like a little buoy there. So they were able to get that cannon back out. And Knox also took credit for something that I imagine the Teamsters probably told him about. when he got ahead of the group to Albany early, and they started drilling holes in the ice to let water up, and then it would freeze at night to make the ice stronger. So in his notes to General Washington or to his wife, he kind of took credit for that idea. But we don't know whether it was really his idea or not, but it worked, and they got across the Hudson River and then headed down to Kinderhook. I was talking about Joe Elliott before. This is a picture of Joe in the August of 1972, and he died just a few months later. And the markers weren't moving until 1975, and in 1974, some big shot in New York State wrote a letter to other big shots and said, Joe Elliott did more work faster than we're able to move these markers. Let's get going. So he was a really neat guy, and he is walking on a lane that when I was a kid, was called Rabbit Lane. He got the name changed to General Knox Lane, which is kind of funny since when Knox came through, he wasn't even officially a colonel yet. But he got it changed, and we believe that that little dirt road that's still there, which connects Shuntull Road with Prospect Lake Road, is the original path that Knox took. Now, because it was called the Noble Train of Artillery, many people think they all traveled together, but that's not the case. There was at least 5 groups that were separate, and they had to be separate because going through this wilderness, there weren't a lot of places to stop and get food and lodging. They had to kind of separate out. So at many times, there was 4 miles separating them. Sometimes Knox was way ahead, sometimes he was way behind. He had his son, his brother, who was only 19 years old, Knox was 25, helping to manage all that. But before we leave Joe Elliott, I wanted to, this was just discovered too over in the New York State files. Egremont Historical Commission has copies of a lot of what people in New York State wrote back to Joe, but we didn't have copies so much of what he sent out. So we found this letter, I'm just going to read, and this was to Walter Miller, who was the head of the Columbia County Historical Society, summer of '72. And he says, my sickness turned out to be cancer on the intestines and liver. So the doc gives me a 1 in 5 of lasting the year out. So, old boy, you'll have to carry the ball to Albany to have the markers changed. So Joe never got to live to see the markers moved, but it happened. So this is a simplified version, I think, that appeared in the Chatham Courier that shows probably how Knox went through based on what Joe Elliott's research. So the marker that was in West Ghent on the Old Post Road was moved to a place called Hogaboom's Tavern, which I'll show you in a minute. It was a stone tavern that's still there, a beautiful house. The marker that was in Claverick, that reminds me. I'm sure most people know where Claverick is if you go over to Hudson. One way to keep folks in Columbia County happy is, and we Berkshirites have a habit of saying Claverack. If you say Claverick, they love you. That's what I worry about with that camera going. I might get in trouble. And especially don't say Valety, it's Valatia. Because some folks in Kinderhook and Valatia is part of the town of Kinderhook, they think that Knox went through over the creek in Valatia, and some thinks he came more into town. So they're having their own little discussions, just as we do here, about did he do Brett Road and Hoopi Road, or did he come right through town? And maybe, since they were all separated, some of them did both. As the town historian in Hillsdale says, and I like to copy it, none of us were there. So they came over, so I was talking about the markers. So the marker that was near Catamount got moved up to Green River, New York, which is North Hillsdale, at the intersection of Route 22 and 71, north of Alford. And then the marker that was in Claverick was moved up the Taconic Parkway to the intersection with Harlemville Road. And when I talked in over there. I had a lot of maps and stuff, but we're going to skip over that. And then that just shows a version of the real way we think they went. Now, Boston published this map not too long ago, and they left off the names Egremont, Monterey, Sandusfield, Blandford, and North Hillsdale. So I added it on. In 2012, these two fellows, who were the editors of a magazine called Patriots of the American Revolution magazine, decided that they were going to hike the entire Knox Trail. They were in reasonably good shape, but they had no idea what they were in for. And they'd called, and we'd talked back and forth. They're asking information. And when they got to Hogaboom's Tavern in Ghent, we can't back up, but anyway, they were exhausted. They could hardly walk. And they said, Gary, could you please drive us and show us how the Knox Trail went through North Hillsdale and Alford and Egremont and Great Barrington, and we're going to camp out at Beartown. So I did, and gosh, they were so tired. They could barely walk. But they were enthusiastic. And then as they continued on the gentler roads through central Mass, they still had some help and some rides from time to time. They accomplished their goal. They hiked the entire thing. And we'll be seeing their pictures a little bit as we go along. This map might be hard to see. It was in my book, but it shows a couple of the possibilities that Knox might have taken, even when we're talking about Egremont. So if you were here to hear Bernie's talk or some of the other talks, you probably heard about the old Indian Fur Trail or the Boston Road or the Albany Road or the Great Road. It had 25 different names, but it was originally a Native American path that went, for the sake of our discussion, from Springfield through to Albany. And it was bad road. You've heard people, I'm sure, talk about, some of the early diarists talked about hideous howling wilderness and how really swampy roads. It was tough. So during the French and Indian War in around 1758, General Amherst had to move a bunch of troops and equipment through our area up to Fort Ticonderoga and then eventually to Quebec. And they knew that they couldn't get all this equipment. There's probably 4,000 soldiers through this narrow little road. So he brought in the pioneers, he called them, and it would be our version of the Army Corps of Engineers. And for about maybe 2 weeks before they came, these guys came with axes and rude or basic tools and just tried to chop the road, carve the road, make it wider for folks to get through. And in some cases, they followed the Indian Trail path, and in some cases, they bypassed it. One really good example probably is the original. Last time I used the pointer on this, I goofed up everything, so I don't want to use the pointer again. If you can see it, there's a road that says the Old Fur Trail, Shuntull Road, and then it goes up to White Hill Road. That was the original fur trail, the original road, but we think that when Amherst came through, he was advised it would be much better to make a road up through, along the Green River, on the west side of Green River, through Alford into North Hillsdale and loop around that way. It'd be much easier for the cannons to be hauled through that way. Now, Knox, as the cannons came through, Knox was well behind. So when he was trying to catch up, could he have taken the original old road? It's possible. But for the sake of argument, we'll say we believe that Knox came around Route 21 through North Hillsdale, and I'll show you a few pictures, into Green River through Alford in that way. And that's what Joe Elliott felt as well. Because Knox kept very good measurements of mileage. And Joe checked all that, and all the mileage worked out perfectly for what he thought was the way they went. And here's another map where the lower road is the old fur trail, and then the upper road is where we think Knox went. Now, this map's of much more interest to the folks in Columbia County than here, so I'm going to skip over it, but it gives you an idea of, he took a much easier, leveler way. Interest in Knox in the 1970s really started in the late 60s when a gentleman named Fuller Walker, who was very active in the Boy Scouts, really started to get the Boy Scouts interested in the Knox Trail. And he was really kind of the first to start planning that far ahead in the late 60s, knowing that in 1976 it was going to be the bicentennial. So this photo was taken in the late 1960s, and it's of the late Jim Parrish, who some of you may know, along with Diane Fratellone and Fuller Walker. He envisioned himself as being able to play the role of Colonel Knox, even in those days. And so there they are, kind of thinking and practicing and dressing up in the late 60s for something that isn't even going to happen for another 6 years. And I love this photo because of the incongruity of the motorcycle in the barn.
It's an Indian.
Yeah.
Ooh, I got to remember that next time.
Copyright.
He'd said it's an Indian motorcycle.
Yeah.
And there they are again on their horses. And in '76, they did ride on their horses all the way from Kinderhook to Egremont. And so there's Fuller Walker. I was told by somebody when I gave a talk in Austerlitz that Fuller Walker was so into it that for about 2 years before and a year after the '76 reenactment, he still went to bars and restaurants and everywhere dressed as Knox. He was really into it. He was so into it, he wanted to continue on in Massachusetts, where he bumped up against a little problem. The director of the Mass 250, the whole thing, was along on this trip, and he did not, they'd already picked somebody from Massachusetts to take over the role of Knox once they got to Great Barrington. His name was William Wilbur, and he looked a little bit more like Knox. So they weren't going to let Fuller Walker go, and the excuse was that his oxen were too slow. So there was a lot of back and forth and talking, and then I guess they spent the night at Jug End, where Mimi McDonald and her husband owned the inn, and everyone stayed there the night. They finally decided to let Fuller Walker continue, but he had to go in civilian clothes. I'll show you a picture later of him here in Monterey in civilian clothes. And in I think it was in the Berkshire Courier, I forgot to include this, but there's an interview with him, and he says, "I can't talk to the press. I was told by the higher-ups in Massachusetts not to discuss the situation." So in saying he can't talk to the press, he kind of made his point, I guess. Well, there he is. And then they put on a dinner in Spencertown for them. And it was quite an entourage from Kinderhook over to the Alfred state line. Here's just one of the wagons. Here they are crossing the Taconic State Parkway. And if you look to the left, you can see the marker there that had been moved from Clobber to there. And that's still there, but I just went through the other day, and there's a big snow pile in front of it, so you can't even see the marker. And then they continued on through Harlanville and up a really big hill that was called Cakeout Mountain. There's some debate about whether the word cakeout was Dutch or Native American. It's been anglicized to cake out, like a cake you would eat, and it supposedly means lookout. So I've hiked it. It's a pretty steep hill that they had to go up over, and at the top of it, it's hard to find a place to park, is this spring, there's an actual spring behind the stone thing that says something like "Welcome to Lookout Mountain." And then the Knox Road cut off this main road, the Harlanville Road, Route 21, cut over to Dawson Road and Gellert Road. This was taken during the reenactment in '76. Bravo, Knox Trailmen, you've come a long ways, true Americans. I asked when I gave the talks in New York State if anyone knew if Beth Kruger was still around, but nobody knew. And then it came out onto La Branch Road, and in '76 they had a sign up where the original trail veered off. You can see right to the left of the pole where the original road was, and the Boy Scouts came and cleared that out. So here in Monterey and Sandusfield and Otis, we're really proud that we have long stretch of original road, but in New York State, there's very little. But this 1.25 mile stretch still existed, and it's still there, because when I was first preparing my talks last spring, I drove over there with Jim Moore, who's a hiking partner of mine, and we found it, and we hiked up as far as we could until the brambles and ticks got too bad. So it's still, that little stretch still exists, but unfortunately at the top of the hill, right where the trail went, there's a housing development now, so houses are being built. So again, we're lucky that we have the state forest to protect our section of trail. And that's the housing development, which has been slow in developing. You can see how faded the sign is, but now they're starting to, after COVID, I think people are moving up here more and they're starting to build more houses. Again, in '76, here they are coming back down the original trail, cleared by the Boy Scouts. And that's how it looks now. Still, you can still find it. And that's coming down the hill onto Dugway Road. There's the intersection of Dugway Road and Route 22. And paralleling Route 22 from there to Green River, the village of Green River, which is North Hillsdale, you can still find part of the original road there. And that's the marker in Green River that was moved from over by Catamount. There was a belief by some historians that when they came to Claverick and then went along what's Route 23 to Egremont, the road didn't really exist into South Egremont until a few years later, so they think that the road might have veered off onto what we call Oxbow Road and Prospect Lake Road and came down that way. But that would have taken them way out of their way, much more miles, so I don't think that's realistic way that they could have come. Plus, I'm told that Claverick had a larger than usual group of Tories there, so they really did want to avoid Claverick. The reason there's that confusion is because Ghent was within the district of Claverick. So in the 1920s, when they're reading these records, they see Claverick, they think they went to the town, but they didn't. They went to the district of Claverick, which was in Ghent. The trail goes behind this old school, which is still there, behind this cemetery, and then on the back side of this field it says Future Home of Hope for Heroes, for veterans. So anybody that's driven Route 71 from North Egremont, the general store in North Egremont, through that portion of Alford into Green River, most of that wasn't the trail. The trail was on the other side of the river. Bernie and I hiked it when I was working on my book, and we quickly find out that the reason that they built the turnpike in the early 1800s where it is now is because a lot of the original road was washing into the brook, and it just kept washing in. So smarter people built, when they built the turnpike to Chatham, they built it on the east side of the road where it is now. And there's another road that parallels the river and Route 71 in almost at the Alford line called Stagecoach Road, and that's where we access the old original Knox Trail Road. There it is with Bernie and Rose Hanks. So it's real obvious. We were really excited when we found that portion of the road. And so again, it parallels Route 71 on the other side of the river. And that's a portion that's far enough away from the river that it hadn't washed in yet. And there was some ruins along the way, here and there. When my daughter graduated from either high school or college, probably high school, Bernie, I shared this picture with Bernie, and he sent it to my daughter and said, we wanted to give you a new car, Katie. It's so funny, we still have that card. And I'd hoped that it was a Knox brand car, but it's not. It's a Barrington. And then it did come back out on a road that's still there in Alford called Delia Road. which is now just a little dead-end road, and then peels out onto Route 71. We believe now that the original trail was just a touch to the west of Route 71 through there and right up to the General Knox Lane. Here's our two friends that I picked up because they were so tired, and they're not just posing on the marker, they can hardly stand the way they're resting. So that's the Hillsdale side. Let's see how it looks from the Alford side. Well. There's Judy Wilcox-Durlack, who's in our audience tonight, and she's like her generation of Wilcoxes go way back in Alford. So when I took that picture, I thought it was appropriate to have her stand by that marker. Somebody was supposed to cheer when I showed Judy. So now we get to William Wilbur, who took over as the Massachusetts role of Henry Knox. And so now we got two Knoxes marching along in their uniform, and that's not going over too well. So when they got to Elliott's store in North Egremont, that's when things got somewhat straightened out. But I'm going to show you a few more pictures from '76 that are pretty cool. So it was snowing that day. I was just there briefly. I was only a year out of college, and I had to work part of that day, but I went from Alford to North Egremont. That was about how far I went. There's Jim Parrish again in his costume, along with someone from the New York side. And there's Jim Parrish again. And there's the mail truck that I talked to you about that came to Alford so they could have a postal substation. I can't imagine that happening now. And now we'll go to just a few weeks ago. I was over there in Alford at the Hillsdale State Line for the newest reenactment, where the soldiers fired their weapons and they fired the cannon too. And they had enough snow to haul the sled. When they got to Great Barrington, had to haul the sled on the road. These clever students, up in Saratoga, some vocational high school students created these sleds and built in these drop-down wheels, so when they got to the paved road, they dropped down the wheels and they could roll along. I don't know if they're going to be returned to Saratoga or not, but they're really cool. And here's some of the reenactors. And our state representative, Lee Davis, who was there. Everybody with their Knox Trail scarves. They tried to be very realistic, so when everybody stayed the night at Jug Inn Resort in South Egremont, they actually had a guard posted out all night long with the cannon. He was from Shutesbury. I forget what his name was, but there he is guarding it. And that's a Don Victor photo. Some of the photos I'm showing you are by Don Victor. If any of you knew Don, he was the one that walked around Great Barrington all the time with the camera. And he always said, "Don't worry, there's no film in it." Well, there was film in it. After Don Victor passed away, we went to his house, and the house from the floor to the ceiling, every room was filled with photographs. So we were able to rescue most of them. There's 180 big boxes of Don Victor photos now in the archives. There's William Wilbur again on horseback. I read somewhere that until he was getting ready for this, he had never ridden a horse before, but learned fast. I'm whipping along quick because I know the seats might get uncomfortable after a while. Here's a neat photo that Don Victor took of the oxen from Half Moon, New York, which is up near Clifton Park, with the icicles. Another contingent marching from Alford to Egremont. And there's General Knox Lane that, again, was Rabbit Lane until Joe Elliott got the name changed. That's how the store looked back in the early 1900s. So the General Knox Lane went behind it, where Route 71 or Main Street through North Egremont is in front of it. But it's fun to see an old photo like that and to know that that store is still going strong. Here's a picture taken in '76 again with William Wilbur. Craig Elliott, who was Joe Elliott's son that ran the store after Joe died in '72, He ran the store for another 30 years. And the gentleman on the right was the head of the whole Mass 250, and he's the one that bumped heads with Fuller Walker. Here's our two friends again at the marker in North Egremont. My wife looked at that picture and said, "We've been going to Dairy Queen too much. You've got to lose some weight." Not thinner than. He lost 40 pounds though. There's Fuller Walker just before he had to change out of his uniform with Craig Elliott there in North Egremont. And there he is with Dean Elliott. So Dean was very proud of her husband. She's very, very quiet. She became postmaster after Joe died, and I don't think I ever heard her say more than 3 words. But everybody in Egremont is very proud of all the work that Joe Elliott did. I'll emphasize it again, it's remarkable that a small, tiny town clerk was able to get all of New York State to move their markers. There he is again. So one of the few traffic jams you see in North Egremont, and here it is. Don Victor took that picture too, and I was always going to ask him, how did he take that picture? Was he up on a ladder or what? I don't know. This road, even though it's a vintage photo, probably looks familiar because it's Route 23 coming into Great Barrington. There's a cornfield on the left in the summertime, and right there is where people swim in Green River a lot. And I mentioned before how General Amherst came through in 1758 with thousands of soldiers. That's one of the places we think that they encamped, and it's perhaps the place where the Stockbridge Indians came and met up with them. You can imagine 4,000 troops there. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, so there's a lot written about when Amherst came through. You can find a lot of writing about that. And you can find a lot about when Burgoyne's men and families, because the prisoners, the wives and all accompanied them in many cases, when they came through in 1777, and Burgoyne was not with them. That's been a mistake that's made for years. It was probably a German general, Reisendahl, and I always mispronounce his name, but that's close, Reisendahl, who looked like he was probably Burgoyne, and so everybody thought he was Burgoyne. But that was written about, but nowhere in Great Barrington have we ever been able to find a single word written about when Knox and his Teamsters came through. Jim Parrish was of the belief that they came through north of town, but my theory, and it's only a theory, is it was in the middle of the winter, they're moving fast, they probably stopped, like Bernie suggested, at Dwight's house, the lawyer's office next to CVS. And some people stayed there, but for some reason, nothing was written, nobody wrote down anything. Again, middle of winter, everybody's indoors, they're moving pretty quick. It seems like a reasonable possibility to me. These are some of the artifacts that Matt McDermott, who's a collector, has found just in that field that I showed you. So it was, actually, if you go to Green River swimming, there's a kind of a big outcrop there. And they believe from early documents when the Native Americans transferred property to the settlers, that big stone marker was one of the key boundary points that the Native Americans used as markers. So that may be why there's so much found in that area. So now he's into Barrington, coming through town. Bill Whitaker's Oldsmobile. He was mostly Ford, but for a time it was Oldsmobile. And that's where Pittsfield Cooperative Bank is now. At this point, the old A&P store had closed up, it was boarded up, and that's what's behind there. And there's some young teenagers carrying the American bicentennial flag. And how many, was anyone here the day that, what was his name, the guy?
Jonathan Barkin.
When Jonathan Barkin came and showed the slides that he made in 1975. He was documenting it as a journalist. we realized that that gentleman in the left with the glasses, long hair is him. So that reminds me. So he showed us pictures that he took in '75. Here he is, he must have pictures from '76 too, I would
Yeah,
like to see
he
those.
does.
And there's Colonel Knox with one of the Great Barrington Selectmen, John Tuller, wearing his Irish cap. And there they are on the main street, the steps of Town Hall, with the Massachusetts Bicentennial Director on the left, and Select Board members Paul Gibbons and Charlie Castronova. And way on the right is Mimi McDonald that I've mentioned at Home Jug End. And there she is. She was a great host. Everyone I've talked to raved about how kind and how welcoming Jug End was to this whole contingent. There they are again. I think William Wilbur was really getting into his role with that look on his face. Now we're into, just a few weeks ago, our latest reenactment, which started, they didn't march from Alfred to Great Barrington. They loaded up onto trailers and then unloaded at the VFW and marched in front of the Great Barrington Historical Society. And this is when they're getting ready to march from the Historical Society on South Main Street into Town Hall. And there's our State Senator Paul Mark with the cannon linstock. Now that cannon linstock is what they transferred from New York State into Massachusetts. And having been at some of the talks that I even gave in New York, everyone that had that linstock, and the linstock is what was used to light the cannon, they did not want to give it up. And if any of you were at the event at the Mahawi Theater, Paul Mark even commented about not wanting to give up that linstock. They were really proud of having that linstock. So now it's February. I wonder where the linstock is now. Maybe framing it. And there they brought down the wheels so that they could go up Route 7. A week does not go by when somebody doesn't say to me, Great Barrington Historical Society has a museum? Where? Even though we have a huge sign out front. That's it, across from the VFW. And here's some more reenactors. I'm always happy to see when young people are brought in and involved in all this. All right, I got to tell you a quick story to go with this. And this is a legend. It's not true. Probably not, but it's a good story. And it goes with this. So we talked about, when Knox came through, there was a wooden bridge where the Great Bridge, the Red Bridge, there used to be the Round Bridge, there used to be the Green Bridge. You know what I'm talking about. There was a wooden bridge then, so it would have been much easier for Knox and the Teamsters to go that way over the wooden bridge, so we think they did. But back in the mid-1700s, Mr. Van Rensselaer, who was a wealthy land baron from Albany County, and back in those days, Columbia County was part of Albany County, he arrived in Great Barrington on horseback. It was a dark and stormy night. Barely able to see more than a few feet in front of him, Van Rensselaer finally spotted the dim light of Root's Tavern, which stood on the far side of Housatonic River. And upon his entry into the tavern, Van Rensselaer was welcomed by the innkeeper, who asked him where he had crossed the river. Van Rensselaer answered with puzzlement, well, on the bridge, of course. The innkeeper stated that was not possible because the partial frame for a new bridge had just been erected that day. These wooden bridges, Bernie has written about it, they had to be replaced about every 20 years because they just didn't hold up that much. Anyway, the bridge had, it was so profoundly dark that he couldn't see anything distinctly, but he worried little because his horse was smart and sure-footed. But again, the innkeeper proclaimed that it would have been impossible for a horse to cross the narrow, foot-wide center beam. And after enjoying a tasty cup of flip, Van Rensselaer went to bed, neither man believing the story of the other. So at daybreak, the innkeeper invited his guest to step outside and view the bridge. Peering to his right, Van Rensselaer immediately spotted the frothy, turbulent river, spanned only by one thin wooden beam balanced high above the deep crevasse. He gazed for a moment in astonishment and promptly fainted. I love that story. And there's other famous people that have gone across the bridge. Here's Tony Perkins, not when he was in the movie Psycho, but when he was in the movie filmed in '67 and released in '68 called Pretty Poison. There he is crossing the bridge. And there's our two friends again from the magazine at Belcher Square at that monument, along with David Rutstein, a fellow local historian who just passed away several months ago, so we really miss him. I'm almost done. I'm just going to show you a couple quick things on Monterey and Sandusfield and Otis, even though they will be talked about in the coming weeks. But this is one of my favorite clippings where it says, Henry Knox gets a lesson in 20th century traffic control from Monterey Police Chief Douglas Lyman, a clever caption writer. And there they are again in Monterey. And again, it's a familiar scene. And there, standing on the right, in civilian clothes, is Fuller Walker. So he stayed with them. Sandusfield got gypped, and Ron will talk a lot more about this next week. But because they don't have a official marker there because the markers were put up on the main roads. But there was a Knox Trail sign when we took that picture, but now it's so faded you can't even read it. It's on Beach Plain Road. So I have a feeling, knowing Ron, that this situation is going to be rectified. We'll find out more next week. And in Otis, again, probably most of you are familiar with the Knox Trail in Otis, but that's not where Knox went. The path is parallel to Route 23, more over in the woods. And often those woods on the original trail, this postmarker partially for the horseback riders that delivered the mail to Albany, this still survives, this marker that says 65 miles to Albany. And it's now protected with granite pillars to protect it. And here's another painting of that Mr. Knoll did as they got ready to descend the steep mountain into Westfield. I've talked too long, there's many more stories I could tell you, but I will say that when Knox got to the Greenwoods, which is Monterey, Sandusfield, Otis, Blandford, some of the Teamsters were well behind, and they were becoming very frustrated with the slow pace because they would have to winch the cannons up on the steep hills and down steep hills, and they probably wanted to get back to their families. They didn't think they were going to be gone this long. So when everybody got together in the Greenwoods, Knox gave them a real pep talk and said, look, the work you're doing is going to make this country. And he got them all revved up again to take on what's called the Devil's Staircase, which when the weather gets better, some of us are going to go explore because they think they found the steep area that he went down into Westfield. And then when they got down to Westfield, people were really excited there. They fired off a cannon, and then he let those Teamsters return home and had new Teamsters to take the cannons the rest of the way. So Rob talked about the book we're doing. That's going to be out in a few weeks, and there's the Three Stooges plus two that each wrote a chapter in the book. We're excited about it.
It's sort of a nursing home picture.
That's right. I can hardly stand myself. So, yes, it's been a great but hard knocks life that we've had over the past few months. And I talked too long. There's other stuff I could tell you, but I want to leave a couple minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that he kept really good mileage records. How did he do that?
He had a diary. The question was, how did Knox keep mileage records? He had a diary.
Right, but how did he track the mileage?
I knew somebody
How
would
did he
ask
measure
that question.
miles? They have an odometer on the...
I was asked that question, and we were in Kinderhook, I think, and we were throwing around how he did that. So there, before there was odometers, there must have been old-fashioned ways to keep track of the mileage. But somehow he did, and it was like every few miles he did it. He didn't write much, like all the way from Kinderhook to Greenwoods, to number one. Monterey was called number one. He hardly said anything, but he did keep the mileage. That's one of those questions that I wish I could answer. I don't know. Good question. Anything else? Bernie?
And Knox was on horseback, and he counted his horse's paces as he went.
Good answer.
7,300 paces, you know, however many. What's the theory?
Makes sense. Makes sense to me.
How about GPS?
And we're not sure how much of the path he took versus how, we know the Teamsters spread out some because they had to find different places to stay. So, but we do know how Knox went. But I'm gonna ask an equestrian friend of mine if there's a way to keep mileage of that. So thank you for asking that question. So, although I think this is the last program I'll be giving, so I'll have to save the answer for another 50 years. That's
If
right.
you look at that artist's illustration, you'll see military dress, and invariably in any artwork I've ever seen, there's at least one soldier there, and actually, except for possibly a few times, you know, there wouldn't have been anybody in the military.
Yeah, that's true, that there really isn't there wasn't much evidence of the military being there. A gentleman named Thomas Campeau got his master's in military art and science and wrote his master's thesis on the noble train of artillery, giving examples how modern military techniques, they could take lessons from what Knox did as a sort of a civilian. And he has it footnoted. I haven't had time to really dig in. But in his footnotes, he found some evidence that here and there was local militia that did accompany some of them some of the way. But I haven't had time to dig into that too deeply. But most of the paintings and art that was done then are misleading. Thanks very much.
So thank you all again for coming, and we'll see you again next week.